The Olympics of 1994 has got to be the most famous Olympics for women's figure skating. I only say that because I don't know anything about women's figure skating except about the 1994 Olympics. Matter of fact, I don't really know anything about any sports played on ice except for hockey, and that's only in the last week that I've learned anything about that. But the 1994 women's figure skating involved two skaters, Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan. And there has been movies, documentary, there's probably more information about these two figure skaters than all the other figure skaters combined. I mean, just so much stuff has been written and produced about this feud between these two. Tonya Harding was at one time America's greatest figure skater, but in 1994 she was on the decline, and she was on the outside looking in. Nancy Kerrigan was a rising star, and when the Olympics all turned out, that's how the results showed. Nancy Kerrigan, I believe, got silver, came in second place. Tonya Harding ended somewhere at 8th or 9th, kind of at the bottom of the pack. But we remember the incident leading up to the Olympics, when Nancy Kerrigan was attacked. Leaving an event, a man walked up and struck her on the leg with a police baton. And as everything sort of to work out, fortunately she was fine. A lot of people don't remember that. She was fine. She went on to participate in the Olympics. It was just a bruise, but the attempt was to disqualify her, to prevent her from doing it. And as things kind of unfolded, the drama came undone. Tonya Harding, her ex-husband, hired somebody to do this job. And as they dug a little deeper, they found out that Tonya Harding knew about it. Now, there was a bunch of other stuff going on as well that was behind the backgrounds and things like that. But what would lead a family, what would cause somebody to go out and pay for and have this thing done, to attack somebody? All Nancy Kerrigan did was skate, and skate well. Why would Tonya Harding not say something about this? Why wouldn't anybody speak up? The answer is envy. Envy. You know, we're midway through this series on the 7 deadly sins. This morning, that's the very sin we're looking at, envy. Now, when we talk about envy, there's two close cousins that we have to mention. The first is jealousy, and the second is covetousness. Now, depending on how you use these words, you could use these all interchangeably, depending on what you're saying or what definition you're looking at. But jealousy is really a strong desire for something. It's an inner desire. I might be jealous of, say, Nate and Jess going to Barcelona. It's good to see you back. I might be jealous of that because I'd like to go there. I mean, that'd be great. I might be jealous. I'd love to do that. Jealousy. In some cases, jealousy can be really a good thing if we're jealous for good traits and good attributes, and God's jealous of us. And then there's covetousness, and we mentioned that before. That's a strong desire for something. That's focused on a thing. In the case of greed, it's money. Right? It's all about that thing. And then there's envy. Envy is a feeling of unhappiness at the blessings and fortunes of others. Envy is focused on others. It's not really even focused on the thing that they have, though that's kind of the central problem. It's focused on them, that person. It's a very personal thing. Envy is disdain. It's a nastiness towards another human being because of what they have, because of their success, because of their accomplishments, because of their well-being, because of the things that they've been blessed with. Now, I have to say, envy doesn't always show up like it did in the 1994 Olympics. It rarely shows up like that. Rarely do you see somebody attacking somebody else out of envy. When it does, it gets on the news. It's a big deal. And to be honest, sometimes I think for a person, it may be better when things kind of go like that because everybody realizes it then. everybody can look at it and say, that's envy, and you need to fix that. Because for most people, their envy just stays inside. And it festers, and it reeks, and it grows. It just stays inside of them. And it shows up in their thoughts, and it shows up sometimes in our comments, the snide things, those under-the-breath things that we say. It shows up in how we treat people, but it's not blatantly obvious. It's a very, very sly thing, envy. You know, the traditional color for envy is green. It's what's most associated. It's the color green. And a lot of times when it's depicted like monsters and nastiness. The reason for it, for that color, is it makes you sick. Maybe I could have made the emoji up here, the pukey face emoji or something. Envy makes you sick. Now, of all the 7 deadly sins, some of them have momentary happiness they'll provide for you. Sure, gluttony, greed, lust, some of them, they give you some kind of momentary happiness. Not with envy. From start to finish, envy makes you sick. It is a very miserable feeling. It is itself a negative feeling. It's a nasty feeling. It's an unhappiness. And it's not an unhappiness based on your own being. It's based on someone else's well-being. Now, envy appears in the Scripture a number of times, particularly in the Old Testament. Many of us are familiar with Cain and Abel, Joseph and his brothers. But the story, I believe, at least in my view, that best shows us envy is that of King Saul and David, his envy of David. Now, we're familiar with David. Randy's preached on him a number of times, and it's a familiar character in the Bible, but if you recall, King Saul is the people's king. It's the king they wanted. He looks like a king. He acts like a king. He's just like all the other kings. But he's not God's king. He doesn't follow God's commands. He's self-serving. He's foolish. And perhaps for that reason, he envies David. Now, the young David is by no means the kind of guy that you would think would be king. He's a shepherd. He's quiet. He's in the backdrop of history at that moment. He's not on the front scene. But he's a man who has a heart after God. He's the man that God wants to be king. Now, we don't have time to dig into every single detail, and we're going to kind of flash through the story of Saul and David, and we're going to hit up some of the main points. We're going to see where envy shows up in Saul's relationship with David, and we're going to talk about and look at some main themes in this passage, or these passages, directly dealing with envy. There's a number of, and by the way, these characteristics are universal. So they could be seen in Scripture between Saul and David, and you could see them in your own life. The first is that envy always follows success. Envy always follows success. When Saul meets David in 1 Samuel 16, 21 through 23, he loves him. He's great. Not envious of him at all. David's a shepherd boy who can play the lyre. And so he plays music, brings peace to Saul. Saul doesn't envy him. David's his servant. Now, that's the case with envy in general, right? We never envy people that we think are inferior. And at this moment, I am absolutely certain that Saul thinks David is inferior. He's a servant. And we're certainly not going to be envious of people that we think are below us. We might be guilty of pride, but not envy. This perception changes, though, immediately after David slays Goliath. It changes entirely. And by the way, that act is the ultimate insult to Saul. Saul's the king. Saul's the one that's supposed to go out there and slay the giant. He's supposed to lead the army. He's supposed to be the hero. He's supposed to be the champion. Where's Saul at? Hiding in the back. David goes out and strikes down Goliath. Now, he does it because God is with him, and God was not with Saul. But this infuriates Saul. It's an absolute insult to Saul. At first, admittedly, he's not envious. At first, he sees this as a good moment, right? His servant's risen up, an opportunity to put him in charge. Saul didn't even know anything about David until after this. If you look at 1 Samuel 17:55, as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" He didn't even know who his dad was. He didn't know much about him. But the moment that he goes out there, it's time to inquire. It's time to figure out a little bit more about David. And after he slays him, Saul puts David in a position that he can have more success, that he can be more successful. He puts David over his armies. He actually makes him over the men of war. And so even though Saul at this point doesn't necessarily envy him yet, he gives him the opportunity to do things that will make him envy him. If you read 1 Samuel 18:5, "And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." David's unbelievably successful. Wherever he goes, success follows. He leads the army out, and he's victorious. Victory after victory after victory. I don't know if you've ever met anybody like that. It seems like everything that they touch is just gold. Success, victory. And this is David. You can see the hand of God on David. Wherever he goes, he's victorious. He conquers. And finally, his remarkable victories start to draw attention to him. Finally, after all this fighting, people start to notice. The people of Israel start to notice. And what ends up happening is David and Saul return to Jerusalem. And as they're entering the city, they hear singing. People are coming out to celebrate. The army's back. And what do they sing? If you look in 18:7, "And the woman sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands.'" Did you catch that? Saul has struck down his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Who do they sing the praises to? Both of them, but they particularly notice that David has slayed his tens of thousands, more than Saul. More than Saul. And it's at this moment that Saul suddenly becomes envious. It's at this moment that he realizes that David is suddenly a threat. He realizes that David's the real deal. He realizes that this is a real possibility. I mean, David has everything he needs. What next? The crown? You know, this isn't unique to history, generals taking over and control of a nation. I think of Julius Caesar in Rome. His victories in Gaul lead him to the ability to take over Rome. And throughout history, generals have an opportunity, with their victories on the field of combat, they draw praise, and people look at them and they want to put them in a position of leadership. So it's not entirely unnatural that Saul might look at David and get concerned, because the people are looking at David. They're celebrating David more than they're celebrating Saul. And suddenly, David looks like a legitimate threat. He's no longer inferior. And his success, his victories in combat, draw the attention of everyone around them. And it draws the attention of Saul. And because of his success, Saul becomes envious of him. And so envy always follows after success. Second, envy operates close at home. Operates close at home. As David's fame grows, he grows closer to Saul. And the closer he gets, the more envious Saul becomes. After David kills Goliath, Saul doesn't allow him to leave. You look at 18, verse 2. "And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house." Now, the reason he's doing this is he thinks he's found an opportunity to get more praise for him. Put this man in charge of the armies, get this guy out there. It starts out with a good intention, I suppose. I don't know if I'd call it good, but Saul thinks this is a victory for him. But the closer he gets to the person of Saul, the more Saul notices him, the more envious he becomes. He puts David in charge of the army. Guess who David's best friend is? Well, Saul's son, Jonathan. And it turns out there's kind of a trickery in it and all, but eventually David marries Saul's daughter. Starting to get pretty close, becoming a real family there. Every day Saul sees David. He hears about him from the people singing. He's living with him. He's right there with him. They become close. And because David is so close, so near to King Saul, he becomes a legitimate threat. A legitimate threat. You know, that's how envy works. That's how it is with us. You know, a few weeks ago, I introduced the 7 deadly sins. I said it's a community thing. 7 deadly sins are a community sin. There is none more the case than envy. Because you can't envy without having someone else there. It takes 2 to tangle. All right? You can be a glutton at home. You can buy a dozen donuts and hide in your bedroom and just eat them. No one's going to know. But yet, envy is a community thing. You can't be envious without people in community. You got to have somebody else. And the closer people are to you, the more likely they are to be envious. Families, in churches, and in schools. You know, you're not envious of inferior people. Of course not. Of course not. And you're also not envious of people that are so far above you in stature or distance, right? No one's envious of Bill Gates. I mean, he's got so much more money than I can even imagine. I've never seen the man. He's so far away. I've never met the man. I don't know anything really about him. How can I be envious of him? Or like a high school basketball player is not envious of LeBron James, particularly not after last week. But, you know, you're not envious of LeBron James. They don't know LeBron. LeBron's kind of like a legend. You know, they play him on video games. But the guy that's on the team with them, oh, that's a different story. The guy that's right next to them, the guy that knows how to play basketball kind of like they do, oh man, I can tell you, working at the school and teaching some basketball players, that you can tell envy sometimes shows up. They're talking, oh, the only reason that kid gets the ball is because the coach likes him or favors him or blah, 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 blah. You know, that guy's a legitimate threat. That guy's he's close. And the closer people are to you, the more plausible it is for you to envy them. People that you work with, the guys you play basketball with, fellow students, fellow parents, fellow teachers, even church members. Those are the people you might envy because they're near to you, and believe it or not, they're similar to you. They're not just like you, but they're similar. You think in your head, I could do that. I could do what he's doing. I just don't want to. They're similar to you. They're very much like you in so many ways. That's when Saul starts to envy David. He didn't envy him when he was just this peewee playing music on his side. Now he's a legitimate threat. He could be king. As a matter of fact, he's starting to act and look like a king. Uh-oh. Envy operates close at home. And finally, the third thing to note is that envy grows. By the way, this is true of all sin. It's not just envy. Sin grows. It never stays small unless you destroy it right away. But if you let it there, it will grow and grow and grow and grow. Envy grows. It cultivates in a poisoned, a sickened heart. It gets roots in you. It grows and grows and grows. You know, in the case of Saul, it started out, it didn't exist at the start. It started out very, very small. It wasn't even really there at first. But after David kills Goliath, completely different. When Saul returns and he hears those people singing, he notices it. Look in 1 Samuel 8 through 9. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David tens of thousands, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that that day on. That's where it starts, right there. From that day on, Saul had his eye on David. Starts right there. Starts small. I'm just going to keep my eye out for him. But I'll tell you, it grows real quick. The very next day, if you look down in 10, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing music, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. It starts out with Saul keeping an eye on David, and the very next day, he tries to kill David. He throws a spear. That's a quick way to remove the threat, right? Kill him. It grows fast, so fast. You know, it's not long after this, I mentioned that trickery with his daughter. He tries to trick David. He uses his daughter as the bait. He senses there's something between the two, and he said, hey, you can marry my daughter. The price? 100 dead Philistines. Go and kill 100 Philistines. Well, this doesn't work because, as we already know, wherever David goes, he's successful. So he goes and does that. He kills him. Now, this makes Saul even more envious, but you know what it reveals? That his envy, his hatred of David, nothing can stop it, not even his family. Matter of fact, he lashes out against his son because his son treats David with respect. Jonathan loves David. Saul's envy has grown to such a point, his hatred of David has grown to such a point that not even his family, his love of his family, can turn him away. You know, at this point, there's just no turning back. Saul's envy and his hatred has turned into insanity. He's gone insane. He's raving around his house. You know, the highlight of this is shown to the priests of Nob. These are a group of priests, a community that supplied and provided for David. David was fleeing Saul, and he goes there and he gets food and supplies. They even give him a sword. Now, the priests didn't know better. By the way, David was loyal this entire time. It's kind of crazy, because if it was me, absolutely not. I'd have been done. But David is loyal all the way through. He never once wanted to strike out and destroy Saul. That was not his intention. And the priests see that. They help him. They help him along his way. They had no intention of harming Saul either. But Saul doesn't care. Saul doesn't care at all. If you read 1 Samuel 22, jumping ahead a few chapters, 17. And the king said to the guard who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David. And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. At this point, even the priest of God can't be saved. His envy has grown so much, it's turned into real murder. By the way, his men won't follow it out. They won't do it. He has to get an Edomite, an outsider, to carry out the judgment. It says later they put the whole town to destruction. And Nob, the city of the priest, he put to the sword, both men, women, child, and infant. Ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword, which I think is interesting, because if you know the story of Saul, early on he wouldn't put a town completely to the sword, which God commanded him to, but he has no problem doing it here. Infants. Catch that? Infants. These people were innocent, and Saul didn't care. He was so insane with hatred towards David, so afraid of losing power, that no one, not his family, not innocent children, not priests of God, will turn him away. Nothing will stand in his way. Saul's envy's poisoned him. It's turned him green on the inside. He's gotten sick. And he's gone from a bad king, because from the start of this, he really was a bad king. He was a king that didn't honor God. He's gone from a bad king, though, to an insane tyrant. A madman, a lunatic. He's beyond reason. Even the reason of the world, he's lost it. Envy's twisted and turned inside of him. It's broken him. You know, and this whole time, David is trying to repair and fix the relationship. He saves Saul's life at one point. He spares him. He keeps trying to fix it. Doesn't matter. So It's gone. The envy has completely ripped him apart. His hatred, sin has festered itself so much in the life of Saul, he's beyond repair, it appears at least. He's absolutely been destroyed. And so it is with envy. It grows, it festers, it blossoms, and it turns into insanity. It turns into insanity. You know, Tanya Harding, that whole situation, it's not like they became envious the day that man struck her, Nancy Kerrigan, in the ankle. That's not when they became envious. She'd been envious. Her family had been envious for a long, long time. It was on that day that it turned into insanity. It had grown to such a point that something like that could occur. Envy always has humble beginnings. It starts out very, very, very small. It starts out in our thoughts, in the things that we're thinking and how we look at people. It's very small where it starts. You know, we look at someone who gets a promotion at work and we start to think, I deserve that. They shouldn't have got that. That should have been me. You know, and it starts in thoughts and we start thinking about it, and then it grows and we start to verbalize it for a lot of us. This is kind of the path, right? We start to think about it. I'm not sure exactly where it turns into a sin, but certainly when you start to verbalize it, there's gossip there. There's a bitterness in that certainly is sin. We start telling people, our coworkers, we start talking about it at lunch. We start complaining about people. This is where we notice the envy of others, all right? It's at this point that we start to really pick it up. And then it's not long before that, you know, if it keeps on going, it's not hard for it to turn into real action. And if you let it really fester, it can turn into something really awful. It can turn insane. Start doing things to hurt people, find ways to try and cut people short, look for avenues to prevent them from moving or growing. It turns into insanity. Envy is linked to a lot of sins. It's linked to a lot of sins. It can be inactive, and this is kind of how it shows up in the church a lot of times. It's linked with sloth. The old theologian J.I. Packer he'd point this out. He recognized it, and he would talk about how it's always the slothful Christian who sits in the pew who's often very envious. They're sitting in the back complaining about what other people are doing. They're cutting them down. They're being nasty, and all the while they don't do anything. A lot of times that's how envy shows up in the church. But it can be very active as well. When it's active, it's linked to dozens of sins. I mean, you could pretty much name anything. It shows up in hatred, murder, racism, theft. I mean, envy can be linked to anything. When you're envious and you start to lose your mind and start acting irrationally, you can be guilty of a whole host of sins. And it grows, and it reeks, and it festers. Proverbs 14:30 says that envy will rot your bones. It'll rot your bones. It's true. I don't know if you guys ever seen a dead carcass on the side of the road. It reeks, it rots, it stinks. You walk by it one day, you come by the next, it's much worse. It's nasty. It's what envy looks like in our lives. Become walking, talking dead carcasses. The unfortunate thing about envy, I think, is that every one of us at some point or another experiences this sort of thing to a certain degree. It certainly can dwell in our thoughts. And it's oftentimes it can show up unintentionally. And when I see it, the crazy thing is I see it, and I'm sure most of you have seen it, all over the place. In church, wherever you work. I mean, I see it with students. You see it with everyone. And most of the time, it just kind of bubbles up into a little comment or something small. But you've got to be really cautious because it is so easy for it to be something real little, for it to be a nasty thing that you say about somebody else at church or at work, and then you just start dwelling on it, and you start repeating it over and over and over and over again. And slowly but surely, it starts to make you miserable. You start to look green on the inside. And we're all tempted with it. And for that reason, we have to be extremely cautious. We have to look and be very careful that we don't allow this to turn deadly on us. What do you do about envy? How do you avoid it? How can you cut envy short before it really sprouts into an actual sin? How can you prevent it from happening? In the story of Saul and David, there is a character that we've not mentioned. His name is Jonathan. He is the son of Saul. And at this time, it appears like, he doesn't become, but it appears like he'll be the future heir. He'll be the one who takes the crown. But where Saul envied David, where Saul looked at David and saw a threat, Jonathan loves David. Jonathan loves him. Look at 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 3. And this is all right after David kills Goliath. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And then jump down to 3. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. You know, Jonathan has every reason, just like Saul, to envy David. All those things that I said were true about envy, that was the same thing with Jonathan's life. I mean, they were close. Jonathan, more than anybody, saw the success of David. But Jonathan didn't envy him. He loved him. He loved him. You know, Spurgeon, commenting on this, Charles Spurgeon, a preacher in England some years ago, commented on this friendship, and a number of people have commented on it, and he says, "You cannot have a real friendship that is all for the taking and never for the giving." That's how Jonathan's friendship was. He really did love him sacrificially. I mean, he was willing to give up his crown. He was willing to take the abuses of his father. His father was turning on him because of this. And yet Jonathan loved David. I believe that Jonathan saw in David the work of God. He saw this great accomplishment and he loved it. He loved it. Whereas Saul also saw the hand of God and was terrified. He was envious. How do you avoid envy? The answer is love. Love, love, love. That's how you avoid becoming an envious person. You are a loving person. You love those around you. You love your siblings. You love your friends. You love your enemies. You love your coworkers. You love your neighbors. As Jesus commanded, you love God and you love others. You love. Now, Paul said in Corinthians, in his famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7, he says, love does not envy. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. Love does not envy. If you love somebody, you can't be envious of them. You can't have a nastiness towards their success. As a matter of fact, when you see that, you celebrate it. You're overjoyed. You should find joy in that. You know, it's like your neighbor gets a new car. One neighbor can come out and look at that car and be like, man, why did Bob get that new car? That's ridiculous. I deserve a new car. I'm tired of Bob. Bob doesn't, trim his trees. Bob is, and be envious. And another neighbor, the loving neighbor, could walk out and look at the car and say, good for Bob. I'm glad Bob got a new car. Oh, he must be so happy. I'm going to go over and check that car out. Let Bob know I'm so glad that he got a nice new car. It's just a different perspective. It's almost like putting on a new pair of glasses. You're just looking at things completely differently. God calls us to be loving towards people. In the best way, love can suppress, can conquer envy. Celebration kills it. Right? When that love flows into celebration, you can completely kill envy. I mean, if you think about it, right after David kills Goliath, one man, Saul, gets envious, turns to hatred, and the other, Jonathan, doesn't necessarily say he celebrated, but he loves it. He loves David. Celebration destroys envy. As this morning, as we go from here and we're attempting to avoid envy, we're attempting to conquer envy, to remove it from our lives, the way to do that is to live a life that celebrates. The best way to express love in a form that could destroy envy is celebration. Now, this morning, there are a number of things that you could celebrate. I think in the bulletin we had some graduates. You could celebrate that. Some of those who've graduated. recently. You can celebrate graduates. Everybody can do that. You can all write a card. You can celebrate retirement. Gene, congratulations. You've just been on your celebration tour. You can celebrate promotions. You can celebrate anniversaries. I mean, you can celebrate the people in the church. You can celebrate those at work. You can do all kinds of stuff for the big things. We typically do a good job at that, but we can also celebrate little things. Little things. Birthdays, concerts, stuff that happens every day. Good grades at school. You can celebrate tiny little things. You can celebrate everyday things. You can go out of your way and just be thankful for what people have done and really congratulate them. Go out of your way and celebrate. And however you do it, I always have a stack of cards in the church office, and I have to remind myself, because I'm not a celebrator, writing people, thanking them for what they do, making sure I'm writing out occasionally. And cards for me is an easy thing. It's a very tangible way. Otherwise, I'd forget. Text messages, though, you can shoot people a text message, an email. You can tell them in person. You can find all kinds of ways to celebrate the accomplishments, the things that God is doing in the church, and the good things that are happening in those around you, your neighbors' lives, your coworkers' lives, your family, your friends. You can find ways to celebrate and to just find joy in the accomplishments of other people, to find joy in that, to see the good things that God is doing. And so for the next week or two, my challenge is for you to find some ways to celebrate more. And I don't know, you can write this down. Look and think at what are some things that you can celebrate. How can you do it? Are you going to send a card? Are you going to send a text message? Maybe every day, just look for something that you can celebrate. And it might just be saying, hey, thanks for doing that, or I appreciate you for doing that. It might be a small comment. But start to look for ways that you can celebrate. If we as a church love one another more and we celebrate one another, I think that we will be a ministry in a church that reflects the love of God more. And we'll be a church that lacks envy entirely. You guys want to close with me in prayer?